Good morning and welcome to today's Top Business Tech webinar, where we will discuss if technology is the key to ensuring global sustainability. The 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, saw leaders from over 100 nations come together to discuss the impending climate crisis and our collective role to restore the planet. Following the event's conclusion, the various ways in which technology can assist us in being more sustainable and the role required of businesses in achieving net zero has become very clear. And while technology will help in many ways, there is also a less sustainable side to technology, and the tech industry needs to address this in order to reduce its carbon footprint. To dig deeper into these ideas today, we have a panel of experts joining us that I would like to introduce you to. First up, we have Mark Lilly, Partner, Global Tech Strategy and Transformation at Deloitte UK. Mark leads Deloitte's global technology and strategy transformation business across 35 countries and more than 4,000 staff. He has spent his career working with boards, CIOs, CFOs, and business leaders on digital transformation, organization redesign, business change, technology strategy and transformation programs, innovations, and the establishment of alliances and ecosystems. Welcome, Mark.
Morning.
Next up, we have Anthony Callias, co-founder of TreePoints.green. Anthony is the co-founder of TreePoints, a platform that enables businesses and individuals to access the best climate action initiatives via subscriptions and API integrations. This amplifies the process of backing the most effective carbon offsetting, tree planting, and plastic recycling projects, and showcasing efforts to the community. Welcome, Anthony.
Hi, thank you.
We also have joining us today Tim Meenuk, co-founder and CEO at Pivot Energy Services. Tim is the CEO of Pivot Energy Services. He co-founded the company in 2017 with a focus on addressing the funding gap in building decarbonisation. His deep knowledge of the financial sector has been fundamental in securing the company's partnerships with ESG funders. Welcome, Tim.
Morning, thank you.
And lastly, we have John Cullum, Director of Commercial Sales, Sustainable Technology and Solutions Centre. John spent over 12 years helping clients benefit from a wide range of renewable energy and energy water saving solutions. He has a depth of knowledge of energy saving technologies and plenty of experience in finding clients fit for purpose solutions to help them future-proof their homes and their businesses. And welcome, John.
Thank you. Good morning.
So just to start off with, I'm going to ask each of you to share your opinion on the outcomes of COP26 and if you think the outcomes of COP26 will influence the tech sector. Mark, if you'd like to kick us off.
Well, great, thank you, Amber, and great to be part of this the discussion group. I mean, I sort of yinged and yanged a little bit, I think. At one point, I was sort of hugely optimistic, and then a sort of could we have done more? I mean, I think the media attention that sort of raised awareness was fantastic. It's nudged business, it's nudged, frankly, everyone in society. So the fact that it was front page news, I think, is really good, together, of course, with the governmental proclamations. I suppose I firmly believe you get what you measure. It's kind of one of the business rules, I guess, that's guided me. And I think one thing that was not maybe reported quite as visibly as some of the announcements was the establishment of the International Sustainability Standards Board, so the ISSB. It was signed by more than 40 world leaders, and it encourages global private investment into new technologies. It has the potential to really turbocharge the uptake of clean tech, I think, by imposing those standards, policies. And I think key is the measurement on those, because no one wants to be lagging on that sort of global list or that global league table. So I think that was really important, actually. I think on coal, the first step to stop the funding of coal, really, really important. I think also the fact that the review process is now every year rather than every 5 years is really important. I mean, a shame about the sort of the tweak of wording at the end. I think that China and India sort of put in place to the global announcement. The methane pledge, really good. I think that the Mark Carney, the 130 billion investment initiative, and that really points, I think, a direction around. It's not just government that can make announcements. I mean, Deloitte, we played a part of that and one of the signatures around that. So I think that's quite important. But of course, on the tech, I think we all intuitively know that tech is such an enabler for all of this. and certainly see sustainability and ESG as top priorities for all organizations across all sectors, but also for tech leads. And I think on this call we've got quite a few tech leaders. So I think the role of technology leadership to help organizations kind of stay connected, be productive. And we're talking earlier about, allowing us to really question, do we need to jump on that flight or not? Because you can work perfectly well in certain situations and collaborate effectively by not jumping on that plane. So I think it is a big moment for tech, actually. It's all about the data. It's about measurement and monitoring, simulating through digital twins, things like that. So I'm overall, I'm really positive, actually. And of course, now it's all about implementation, execution, and getting after the progress that we all desperately know we need.
Yeah. And John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I do. Certainly from the measurement and monitoring aspect, we work lots of clients, and that's where we start with the energy monitoring aspect of things, so that we can get a sort of baseline of where energy is being utilised throughout the organisation, and where to start in terms of investment, in terms of improving the consumption. If you can find ways of future-proofing and proof of concept with the energy monitoring in place, then it makes life a lot easier to be able to justify the investments and provide some focus. So we do use some tech which to kick things off and to start with, and that can be used throughout the organisation. Even just utilising that technology on its own can identify savings quite quickly, or we call quick win savings. Things that you can put on timers, things that you didn't quite realise were costing you so much money. So it can identify quite clearly what an organisation is doing in terms of their energy consumption 24/7, and then you can use tools, or those monitoring tools, to prove concepts of retrofittable solutions. So if we've got a bit of technology that claims to save 25% on air conditioning, we need to prove it, and especially if it's going to be rolled out across a large organisation. So we do a lot of that initial kind of localized projects where we do proof of concept, but the energy monitoring bit is absolutely key to understanding what's going on in the environment, and where you can make some quick win savings to build confidence to move forward, and then look at bigger investments such as solar and such like. So the default happens to be solar and LEDs, but there's actually about 20 or 30 other solutions that are available, and that can be applied depending on what the organisation does and uses within their energy consumption. So yeah, that would be my contribution. It's actually a lot easier than you think to do. It's the technology is easy to install. It's not too expensive, and you can identify things quite quickly now and move forward quite quickly. So there's no question really.
And Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, my takeaways from COP and what they mean for us and our clients are echoing what Mark's talking about, and sort of measuring it and allowing benchmarks to be transparent, naming and shaming at the bottom end, and showing the sort of beacons of good forward movement at the top. I think it's combining the submission of data and understanding where you as an organisation fit and where you should be going, with pledges for a lot of money, a lot of government funding, and sort of commingling that with private finance is great. But it is nevertheless a big step to go from, here is my problem and this is how I'm going to execute on it, and even if the money's there, how do I access it? So I think technology has a huge role to play in providing that platform and being the conduit for the transfer of the utilisation of capital, but also identifying exactly where it should be spent. And we're very much in that space, creating both the digital twins, the diagnostics, but on the same platform, being able to fund it efficiently. And I think that's my key takeaway, that if there are these pledges for finance coming through, then let's create the volume of opportunities for it to point at, and create a standardized format for people to draw down that capital in whatever organization you're in. Once you've formed the diagnosis, we need to get to execution as quickly as possible.
That's great, thank you. And Anthony, what were your takeaways from the event?
I think Mark gave some really good specific policy benefits around the methane and the coal changes, and a lot of discussion around further standardization, which John and Mark have mentioned is really helpful to measurement and then ongoing change. I think from our perspective, another thing that's been great is I know that some activists were maybe not overly pleased with outcomes, but I think all of us kind of come from a more practical perspective and expect incremental change. So, you know, those changes that we did see are positive. And generally, I'd say it happens every time that there's such a meetup, but it really galvanized, I think, public opinion and businesses' opinions, even if you know, strict compliance requirements haven't yet been enforced. People understand to start expecting them at some point in the next decade, and also just public appetite, like an understanding that it's something that consumers are deeply interested in and employees are deeply interested in. And I know, you know, outside of specific tech for monitoring, or in our case, tech for helping people access these sorts of initiatives, all sorts of other you know, community programs that have been popping up as a result of it.
That's great. Now, I'm going to jump into some questions that I will put to each of you, but I'd love to invite all of you to jump in if you also have any opinions. So just to start with Mark, I know we've just touched on digital twin technology, but with the UK announcing its plans to accelerate clean tech investments, what clean technologies are key for businesses to implement?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question. I suppose I always look at the world from a supply and demand perspective. It just sort of segments it for me. So, you know, on the demand side, you know, you've got, I think, you know, John mentioned this specifically. It's all about the, you know, the data. So smart meters is a really important technology, and sub meters to understand what you're consuming. If you have visibility of that, you can make adjustments, you know, and change behavior. Of course, also on the demand side, we need to use less energy, so investments in insulation and so on. I think I've mentioned before traveling less. I mean, I hate to confess, but my carbon footprint from travel used to be just horrific. I mean, I'd be one of those people who jump on a plane the whole time, and it's been an education for me over the last 18 months that I don't need to. I actually with my Canadian colleagues a couple of weeks ago, partook in a virtual reality conference. So I was sort of kicking off this conference, and I was standing on stage, and I was looking behind at a great big screen, and I could see the audience out there, but I wasn't, of course. I was actually sitting on my chair in my office in Windsor with my VR headset on, and it was extraordinary. I mean, it really was extraordinary. Very, very cool. And as you wandered up towards someone, their voice got louder, so you could talk, you could point and click, and you could see who they were, so you could introduce yourself. And then as you walked away and went close to someone else, their voice got louder. I mean, it was all I mean, it's very, very clever. I mean, clearly not the same, because you're looking at an avatar type person as opposed to a real person. But in terms of educating me on how technology can make a difference from working, I found it personally extraordinary. I mean, I think also, you know, investments in electricity storage is going to be fundamental, because you know, in the sort of the devolved nature of consumption and generation now, storing it is going to be the key to balance out that supply and demand. I think electrification of all things mobility, of course, cars, I think scooters and things like that are really exciting. Even if you're a DIYer, you know, this time of year, leaf blowers, it always used to be sort of petrol powered things. They're now all electric, either battery powered or plug-in. So there's a whole electrification piece going on the demand side. I mean, I think on the supply side, we are moving clearly into a more sort of, decentralized, distributed world, wind, solar. I think leveraging the uniqueness of geography is quite interesting. Of course, at a national level, I mean, in the UK, we're on an island, lots of water, lots of wind, lends itself to things. Southern Europe, lots of sun, lends itself to things. I think when you go to a regional and local level, proximity to hills or rivers or flat surfaces, there's ways to exploit what you have locally. And I think we'll have a lot more localized solutions with partnerships forming, which I think is quite exciting. And then, of course, as we all know, tech enables everything. I think it's critical, whether it's 5G enabling sort of communications, the Internet of Things, and the sensors on devices on those distributed assets, monitoring and alerting around maintenance and so on. I think AI and all things augmented decision making are going to be super important for optimizing that whole system. I mentioned kind of digital twins at the beginning. I think now you can simulate the physical world and the digital world is really, really important to sort of test resilience and so on. I think there's going to, good old blockchain is going to find its way in somehow. Sometimes a technology looking for a problem to solve, I think, more than the other way around. But I think it's really exciting. But I do think AI and all things data has the opportunity to be a real game changer around carbon abating solutions, particularly with large companies. There's so much data you can start to really learn from within the organization. And I do think, I suppose, as we use technology and digital more broadly, we have to need to think about the carbon footprint of the tech itself. So I think technology leaders need to think about the consumption of that data. I mean, committing to green power, whether it's through the hyperscalers, working with them who are innovating hugely around this space, developing technology sort of ecosystems that are sustainable and so on. I think there's technology leaders play a really critical role, I think, for the wider enterprise.
And John, this is a great time to bring you into this conversation. Of course, achieving carbon neutral status is something a lot of companies can shout about, but how can large businesses get to this stage through the use of technology?
I think it's an important point, actually, to shout about your proud achievements with your investments and how well you're achieving your carbon targets. I think it's something that should be shouted about, wildly over the next few years to support each other and knowledge share more than anything else. One of the things that we're not particularly great at in this country is sharing the knowledge particularly well, and I've found that across public sector and private sector organizations. So we're going to be shouting a lot louder about some of the solutions that we've helped clients with in terms of their journey to carbon net zero. But as I said right at the start, the energy monitoring piece is really where it all begins. So you can get good baseline data, and if you've got some energy champions that are keen to support that, it becomes easier to work on. And then there are solutions that are actually really practical and really easy to implement. And obviously, if you've got the energy monitoring in place, you can work out what your carbon savings are and your energy savings, and just roll on from there, really. So, everyone's at a different stage. Everyone's, has different organisations with different amounts of energy that need to be saved. And we went to a factory the other day where they hadn't looked at LEDs, and the heating was still gas heaters up in the ceiling, blowing air right out into the car park. Huge amount of work that required there. Great big roofs for solar available, all south-facing. So there's so much that still needs to be done in this country to really nail down the consumption and then look at renewables. And there's some fantastic solutions available now to adopt, not just solar. There are wind technologies that are coming up for homeowners and small businesses. So it's really an interesting time, and we'll be testing and improving all of them as we go forward. But there's some quick win stuff that's easy to achieve with some proven technologies, and some fabulous technology companies that are based in the UK as well. So they need supporting just as much as technologies that perhaps made in other countries. But and I'm really proud of that as well, to be honest. But so yeah, so we'll be doing a lot of shouting and making a lot of noise in our corner down here in the south. You know, happy to support anybody that needs help, even if it's just small steps to begin with. But yeah, there's plenty to look at and review. And as I said, you can monitor and measure it all and progress from there. So.
And as you said, there are still a lot of challenges that this country faces. Tim, I wanted to ask, what is the biggest issue facing decarbonisation in the built environment, and how can we use technology to get around this?
Yeah, well, Pivot's a climate tech company for the built environment, and we use AI to make decarbonisation projects financially executable and increasing speed and scale. And we do this by addressing what we see as the biggest challenge, to answer your question, which is around when a significant amount of money needs to be spent, what is the risk that it will actually deliver what it's intended to do? And particularly when the board, the decision makers, are not technically sophisticated, because that isn't their core business. And there's a lot of opportunities, as John was saying, that don't require much capital investment at all, and those need to be exhausted to begin with. But where there are sort of capital intensive requirements, it's a significant sort of outside of BAU decision. And what we do is quantify the risk of that technical underperformance and can present that to any stakeholder in a really simple to understand way that also can connect that to people who are very comfortable taking that risk. So once you can measure it, as Mark was saying at the beginning, you can do some interesting stuff with it. And what we do is able to ensure that technical performance. So the risk metrics that we produce are underwritten by a global insurance company. And what that means is that they can take away that performance risk in totality. And then the lack of knowledge or comfort around a particular technical problem in your building can be taken on board much more easily, and if you want, can be financed much more cheaply than a standard financing package. I think the other challenge is that decarbonisation is essentially an infrastructure problem, and as we all know, infrastructure is a long-term play in terms of the sort of emissions reduction, but also the financing that needs to accompany it. And once you take away the risk of performance using the insurance, you can finance it over much longer timescales. And we see that a lot when we're working with different customers who wouldn't otherwise do a project, and therefore would get nowhere near to net zero unless they had some long-term financial partners sitting alongside them. So we can link right from the digital twin to the financing and enable different formulations to be constructed by non-technical people.
That's great, thank you, Tim. And of course, and Anthony, John has started to touch on this, and Tim has just mentioned about just how long infrastructure changes are going to take. With this in mind, what is the importance of companies using tracking applications to monitor their carbonisation production?
Yeah, definitely touched on it with Tim and John. I think to summarize it in a quote, what you can't measure, you can't improve, right? I think it was a famous management thinker who said that. We'll assume it's the case. I guess fundamentally, it helps companies understand a few different things. First of all, it helps you take responsibility for what is effectively your impact. That's fair and clear, and that's also something that relates really well to marketing initiatives. And ultimately, if you can overlap the incentives between your marketing team and your sustainability teams, you're going to have greater success. I think the other thing is that when you have that insight into what is causing your primary emissions, it helps you to prioritize, because as John and Tim said, it's a long process. Important part of that process is taking the most effective, easy step. It's the same as any other process, right? If you're running your business and you want to grow your revenue or whatever, you'll make a little matrix, and it's like, okay, what's costly to non-costly, easy to hard, and you start with the things that are easy and not costly. And then it kind of comes back to what Mark was saying. If you're assessing your footprint, an insight that you could have is like, look, we're traveling a ton. Maybe we don't need to travel as much, and that's a great example of something that's both easy and not costly. Maybe you work with someone like John and you realize, okay, actually, we get some timers in, we swap to LEDs, again, something that's easy and non-costly. So I think tracking really helps people identify the low-hanging fruit and prioritize dealing with those.
That's great, thank you. And John, just building on from this, of course, we've talked about bigger companies and larger infrastructures. What about smaller companies? What can they do to make a positive contribution? And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the funding that's available to smaller companies.
Yeah, sure. There are pots of grant funding dotted around the country which do help. They're running out, unfortunately, but there are pots here and there which can be provided through local councils, etc. But there needs to be more, to be honest, and to support the changes. I'm going to keep going back to the energy monitoring piece, because that's really where it starts. It's very inexpensive now, and that will give a roadmap in terms of, or better visibility of what an organisation is doing inside and outside of working hours. As Anthony was saying, the low-hanging fruit there is to find simple solutions to switch things off or put timers on things. You'd be surprised just by having better visibility where you can make some immediate savings and have an impact. And it's not always technology led. It could be other things that to make the organisation more sustainable, and way in which you deal with waste and use certain things inside the organisation. So there's all sorts of. I would encourage people to collaborate and share ideas and come up with different plans for their organisation. In terms of financing certain projects, that's also possible. So there's energy as a software as a service, or energy savings as a service type schemes, where you effectively lease the equipment until it's paid for itself over a couple of years, and it's a cost neutral investment. So that those that's easily achievable, and also with monitoring in place, you can monitor exactly how much you're saving versus how much it could cost you per month. So again, it becomes quite an easy cost neutral way of doing things. But yeah, so there are steps that you can take which don't cost the earth and excuse the pun, but they don't, and you can have quite an impact in terms of getting started with this journey, and then build up from there, really. But it will depend on case by case. Every organisation is different, and we always we're always shocked by what we discover sometimes, and sometimes the organisations are as well. They didn't realise how much energy was being consumed between 7 o'clock at night and 7 o'clock in the morning. So just switching stuff off or putting some timers in place will affect that hugely, and then with the savings created from there, you can invest some of that into other areas too. So but there's going to be a massive shift next year with the energy prices going fairly high, as we're seeing quite an increase in people crawling out of the woodwork and saying, help, we need to make a start. Where do we begin? And that's going to force some change next year, I think, or it is already. Yeah. So, and if people can move towards, as Mark was saying, electrification it's inevitable really with electric vehicles and battery storage. The introduction of renewable energies it's just all going to move towards that area and move away from gas and oil as best as we can. There are solutions, infrared heat solutions. There are all sorts of air source heat pumps, etc., that are gaining a lot more attraction, and people are finding out a bit more about what those technologies are and how they can be installed. Some of them are feasible, some of them are not, but there are lots of solutions out there. So there's lots of choice really for people to investigate.
And Anthony, did you have something to add? I couldn't quite tell if that was a hand.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say as well, but I will come to it later, but just briefly, and then we'll talk about it in more detail. You're talking about financing these changes. I think one thing that we were mentioning before, actually jumping on the live call as well, was the impact that your company's stance on sustainability has on hiring and retention. And then also there's quite a famous, well, now famous report from NYU's business school where they found that products marketed as sustainable generally sold actually or grew at a rate of 5.6 times more than other businesses. So there's certainly, like, particularly if you have a lot of physical infrastructure, there's a lot of schemes that can help you finance solar panels and similar. But I mean, there's also a strong argument to just see your sustainability initiatives more as an investment in your company, both in terms of your consumer brand and your employer brand. I mean, it's the nice marriage of activism and policy, where activism has shaped public opinion enough that there are genuine business incentives to be more sustainable. Even if you personally as a business executive aren't overly motivated by the area. You're muted, Amber.
Sorry, and Tim, sorry, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point that Anthony's made around the non-energy benefits of an investment, and I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. If you can, if you've got enough data points to actually look at the productivity gains, retention, etc. I think there are a number of companies out there that will understand that, but nevertheless not have today the resources to be able to deploy to do everything that they need to at once. And I think the energy efficiency as a service model that John was mentioning is a really interesting one, because you can bring forward a lot of things together to do them at a very low cost or zero cost, to have a partner who understands them, to look at just the returns on that investment. And that's what we're seeing increasingly, that we can enable the access to private finance for these schemes, because grant funding is contracting, as people have been saying, but also is difficult to sort of interact with private finance. And I think once you can identify those savings, guarantee them, then the opportunities for financing become much more interesting, and you can really extend and bring forward a lot of activity that you would otherwise need to do over a period of years.
And John said earlier, of course, about so much funding being dotted around, and some people, some organisations would feel that funding is quite inaccessible. Do you feel that there are ways that technology can make this more efficient?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, Tim.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. I think there is a huge amount of funding, trillions, that needs to go into this space for buildings, as well as other parts of the energy efficiencies of decarbonisation requirement. And there is therefore a lot of sort of less experienced money that needs to be brought to bear to be deployed into technical equipment. That is not going to be able to undertake diligence and look at risk in the correct way without standardization that can only be brought to bear through software, looking at these technical risks and turning it into a financial one, or taking the risk and parking it with someone who's better equipped to deal with it. So the financing can be deployed much more quickly. So that's for the software side. I think on the hardware, as John was noting, there is a lot of different solutions that can be used for energy abatement, energy efficiency, as well as on-site generation. And to start looking at this, not just for your own demand, but in collaboration with the community, whatever that may look like, with partner businesses, with social housing, with even with sort of large groups of private residential. Energy communities can be created, and again, there is both software and hardware that can be used to diagnose and design and engineer, and to reach those decisions quicker. And what we will always come back to is, once you can measure it, you can understand the risk, and then you can back that risk out with people who are better equipped to deal with it.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. And of course, while, as you've just listed, many benefits of technology, of course, there are a lot of downsides. And Mark, as you said at the very beginning of our conversation, that the carbon footprint of tech products themselves is obviously a problem. How do you think tech companies can improve upon this?
Yeah, I think it's really, really important. I should just so energy as a service. I think John introduced it, and we're all fans of this. If you Google energy as a service, there's a really good Deloitte article about that. So just to alert people to that piece of it. I think it's quite an interesting read. So it made me think, this conversation, that how the food industry, there's all the packaging around, the calories, the carbs, the percentage of fat, and all that sort of. I think it's only a matter of time before products we buy will have that with some sort of carbon measurement. I mean, because people, to the point, I couldn't agree more with the points made. People really care about it now, and I've had an electric car for almost 5 years actually, and I drive it around. It makes me feel good that every time I'm driving it around, I'm not pumping CO2 and carbon monoxide or anything else into the atmosphere. But of course, I know that it's not completely net zero, because of course the cobalt came from Congo. It was shipped on a diesel powered liner from probably parts from the US to Rotterdam, and then into the UK. And I think when you get your Ocado thing through, and you realize your beans are from Kenya, I noticed recently. I mean, why have I got green beans from Kenya? I mean, that just, to me, is just absolutely ridiculous. So I think there's going to be a shift to companies, whether it's mandated or not. I mean, we'll come back to that maybe, because that would be interesting. But whether companies will use it as a point of distinctiveness. This is the carbon footprint, and there's a way to abate that if you chose to. But it's just about transparency. Compares us, we're locally sourced or whatever. And I think at the corporate level, we all talk about measurement. You need to measure these things to reduce things. But I think also at the individual level, we're going to get much more sort of transparency around this. I mean, I think with everything, with technology everywhere, not just PCs, but all of the mobile devices, just tech everywhere, I do think that electronic waste needs to be tackled. Determining the responsibility of end of life management of equipment. It's complex, and is it the producer who's got obligations, or the consumer? It's not always clear. So I think waste management regulations, as well as innovative companies around the sort of encouraging that circular economy and the use of IT recycling, and yes, including batteries and the footprint and all that. I do think that's important. And I do think, frankly, tech companies are going to be increasingly held accountable for their share of greenhouse gas emissions. And I do think the superscalers are taking this pretty seriously, actually. And certainly from a corporate perspective, I think putting carbon, transparency, budgeting, offsetting, whatever you want to call it, but at the heart of the business, around your manufacturing processes, your supply chain. I mean, Ant mentioned marketing and so on. I think it's bringing that together because your employees care about this. I mean, your employees are going to leave unless you are doing something about this. And I think, obviously tech leaders can play a fundamental role around it. I mean, not least just forcing your partners, your ecosystems to, if they're providing you with services or technology, equipment and gear, that they source their energy from green sources, for example. I mean, you're mandating that across supply chains. I think if you do a whole series of those things, I think we can get to quite an exciting place, actually, because the net zero obligations then filter across everybody. It's not just the consumer or just supplier, it's that broader societal thing, which is hopefully we can nudge towards.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And just as we come to my last question, I do want to just pull upon what you were saying about offsetting. And Anthony, on top of everything that we've discussed, how can businesses have positive climate impact by supporting offsetting projects?
Yeah, I think it's really important, first of all, whenever anyone's talking about offsetting, and particularly someone who works in the area, I think it's really important to acknowledge that offsetting is an and, not an or, right? Offsetting is a complement to initiatives that focus on reduction, stuff that we've talked about with John, and stuff that you can do within your team. But I think ultimately, like my background is in economics, and it makes a ton of sense when you think about it, that we can create markets for services where people can specialize and achieve it at like impact rates that can't be achieved necessarily within a company. And ultimately, I guess, if you think about reduction, first of all, has a practical limit, which is far above zero. But even then, reduction has a hard limit of zero. It sets a cap as to how much you can do. I think it feeds into a lot of what we've been saying, where, say for example, actually an example to what Mark was saying, a company that does put their carbon footprint on their products. If you've ever been to an Allbirds shop, a large part of their branding is sustainability, that they make their products sustainably. And all of their products, at least in the Covent Garden store that I've been to, actually has a carbon footprint next to each shoe. So you can even choose between their products based on the impact it has. But even then, a sustainable business that cares enough to put their footprint has a footprint, right? Ultimately, the only way to counteract that is to offset. And I think also, speaking about offsetting, both counterfactual offsetting, so stopping emissions going out, but also taking emissions in. I think one thing that people and businesses maybe don't realize about the problem of global warming and climate change is that there's two elements. It's not just about not continuing to put out so much. A large part of the problem is that there's already too much carbon in the air. So we don't really have a choice but to support initiatives that aren't just slowing down the rate at which we're putting stuff out, but start to take some of the carbon out. And some of that, I mean, the most viable technologies that exist or affordable for now are short-term storage solutions like reforestation, afforestation. But it's also incredibly important that we do develop affordable carbon capture for that exact reason. I mean, it's basically we describe it as a stock and flow problem. Even if you reduce practically, the extent to which we can reduce without significantly reducing standards of living around the world, would still, that would perhaps fix the flow problem, but it still wouldn't fix the stock problem. Ultimately, we still need to do something in that regard. And ultimately, it feeds like quite closely into what we were saying earlier. To some extent, it's also a classic example of division of labor and division of expertise. Like there's low-hanging fruit, there's maybe even like mid-difficulty but important things that you can do as a business. But then you will reach a point where actually it becomes more feasible to support projects that are actually specialized in counteracting or taking in carbon. It will actually be more effective than you taking perhaps for the steps. And in practice, you'll probably reach a pretty hard limit on what you can reduce, especially if you actually have a physical product that you have to move around in the world.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. Now, as we have 5 minutes left, I just wanted to ask each of you As you know, we have a lot of technology business leaders listening today. So if I could ask each of you for one final piece of advice that you would give to them on how to improve sustainability within their company, what would it be? So Mark, I'll start with you.
I think look at your business, understand where, if you make an intervention, it's going to make a real impact. It could be in your supply chain. It could be something to do with how you engage with your employees, but find something where there's passion within the organization and you're solving a specific problem. I think don't try and boil the ocean. It's get going, build the momentum, and find that specific thing where you can do something that's really quite special and it's going to garner that momentum with inside your business. Sorry, it's a kind of a generic answer. I think that's a lead from the front. Really make that would be my one bit of advice.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And John.
Yeah, I think just be proud of your achievements, however big or small, and just keep going. Just keep that motivation and that collaboration internally going as much as possible, going forward. And yeah, shout about what you're achieving with it. It shouldn't be something you feel, should just be brushed aside. It should be something that you put right at the front, and that will help to motivate and keep a positive momentum throughout the organisation. I think it certainly does here. As I said, we have to practice what we preach here at our centre, and we're doing as much as we can to make the building here as green as possible and as sustainable. We encourage everybody to throw ideas at us as well. So it's not just top down, it's right the way through, so people feel engaged and motivated and positive about the environments they work in.
Thank you. And Tim.
Yeah, I mean, echo a lot of that. Decide what you're passionate about and what's important, and don't let the tail wag the dog, to the extent that there might not be sufficient funding, or there might not be sufficient risk appetite, or it doesn't fit with some other major strategies, which for the here and now could be more important. There are plenty of parties now in a maturing industry on the service provision that can work with you in a very flexible way to manage your footprint, manage the improvement, and manage your risk.
Thank you. And last but not least, Anthony.
Yeah, I think kind of similar to what others have said, but I guess the two things to do are make it tangible and don't be afraid to market it. And the first one, making it tangible, people relate and emotionally resonate much more when it's understandable. So, what Mark said about picking at least to start a specific initiative that people are clearly motivated by and can get a grasp of is great. Whereas sometimes simply saying like, we're committing to net zero by 2030, actually a lot of people kind of don't, they're like, okay, I get that that's kind of a good thing, but I don't really understand what that means practically. Whereas making a specific change, whether that's like we're making this change in our supply chain, we're changing the packaging in this way, we're removing plastic, we're counteracting everyone's footprint by offsetting it. Those are all things that people can understand. And then to what John was saying about the marketing, I think sometimes we have this funny notion where sometimes doing good is something that you should do with humility. And in life, that's not a bad rule, but in business, ultimately, when you want to do something, when you want to make something scale, incentives have to align. And if you can market it and get more out of it, it's just going to help your business galvanize and do more. And it also is sending a signal to the market, to everyone else, like, hey, this is a thing that you should be doing. So absolutely don't be shy to market the sustainable things that you're doing.
Well, I think that is a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much to our panel members, Mark, John, Tim, and Anthony, for joining us today. It's been really insightful and a very informative discussion. I'm sure our viewers will agree, and will take all of this information today to implement it into their businesses. We would like to thank all of our viewers today for joining us. This will be our last webinar of the year, but please keep an eye on our website for next year's selection. To have a look at the next list of our events, just subscribe to Top Business Tech over at www.topbusinesstech.co. Thanks everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.